Tavis, Smiley, has this ever happened or anything like this ever happened to you before in all your years of journalism?
Never, ever, never. I know Barack Obama is scratching his head like, what just happened here? I've been talking down to these Negroes for 15 years. It was a 2 or 3 page email, and they had attached to it all their Oppo research on Dr. Stein. The one word, Brianna Joy Gray, that I would use to describe the mood, in one word, fear.
Wait a minute, are they just doing this to Black radio hosts?
I don't know that in my lifetime I've ever seen an election that's been driven more by fear. Why wasn't there some massive response, some protest response to why these 2 Negroes lost their jobs for doing what is routine? Because sending reporters questions ain't routine. Everybody is afraid of something.
All right, I have a real treat for the audience today. I have Tavis Smiley in the house. Tavis, you are one of the most prolific and renowned radio commentators, especially in the Black community, and you are also an author, back with a new book, A Covenant with Black America, 20 years later, revisiting the original from 20 years ago, a book about that laid out a kind of a pathway, a chart of policies that could lead to the betterment of Black folks in the United States of America. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
It is an honor to be on the Bad Faith Podcast. As you know, I'm a huge fan of yours. I watch your podcast regularly, so to be a guest on it means a great deal to me. So thank you, Brianna, for the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you reaching out to me for, some color commentary every now and again, but I'm really curious to hear, so close to the election, how you're feeling since you have an opportunity to talk to way more people than I do on a much more regular basis than I do on your show. What's the kind of temperature taking that you've been doing?
Yep. So you're right. I'm on 5 days a week, 3 hours a day in syndication nationally. So I talk to a whole lot of people, frankly, more than I want to these days, because this process is just far too protracted, right? I think if there's anything to take away from Kamala Harris's campaign, it is that one can do this in less than 2 or 3 years. Like other countries do. That's a whole other conversation. You didn't ask me about that, but I'm just opining because I am so tired, frankly, of talking about this race for the last couple of years or so. But that said, at this point, these conversations are becoming, in some ways, more and more difficult to have, more and more bankrupt on a certain level. And I say that only because as you get closer, it's abundantly clear that don't nobody know nothing. You can't trust the posters. Everybody has this race essentially dead even. Nobody knows where these so-called independent voters are. It's hard to know anything. And I've been around long enough, and frankly, you have as well, to know that the posters often get this wrong, particularly when it's when we're inside what they call the margin of error. I call it the margin of terror. We're in the margin of error right now, not the margin of error. So it's just hard to know anything. So the conversations in some ways are becoming more and more vacuous, even as I have to do this every day.
You know, what's interesting? I completely hear what you're saying on that, but that's partly why I've been putting more stake in sort of not polls, which, as you point out, are sort of dead even, but kind of narrative content from, the kind of groups that are convened on CNN, man on the street interviews, those kinds of things. I want to get a sense of what the mood is like and what people's doubts are, or what their questions are, or what their sort of attitudes are toward the candidates. And then it's not the kind of national polls that pique my interest. It is on top of that, the discrete polls that show things like, for example, that Donald Trump has managed to garner a disproportionately high section of Black and brown voters, despite being framed as, and having so much of the discourse around him being about his antipathy toward those groups, or his harshness on the border that it's perceived to be, expected to be a negative for Latino voters, whether or not that's true. So I wonder, as someone who gets to talk to a whole lot of Black people about this on a weekly basis, how much you're seeing of that, or whether or not you think that's going to be damning for Kamala Harris in a week or so.
Yeah. It's going to be fascinating to see, when all is said and done, how these numbers shake out vis-a-vis Donald Trump and African-American voters and Latino voters. I'm just not sure, again, that the posters have this right. that these discrete polls even are on point about this. And so it's just hard to sort of opine on it because I really don't know where this thing is going to shake out. I do believe that there is a way in for Donald Trump to these voters. And as I talk to people, again, this is not scientific, but as I talk to people, there is this, and there are a variety of ways to frame it, but there is this, how might I put it, this sense that people have of Donald Trump, that he's willing to give, to be frank about it, to give the bird to the system, right? Just give the middle finger to the system. And there are a lot of people who have a lot of grievances, Black, brown people who legitimately, I think, Breonna Joy Gray, have a lot of grievances with the system as it is currently structured. And anybody who they see coming along that who's willing to just tell the system where to get off and talks about blowing it up, and anybody who frames themselves or presents themselves as a disruptor, I think appeals to those voters at a very visceral level. So I don't think it has to be much deeper than that. He's appealing to them at a very visceral level. He did it well, some years ago to white male voters in particular. And I think he's now doing the same sort of thing. This sort of, the system is screwing you, and I'm the only person that can protect you from being screwed by the system because the system continues to try to screw me. So I'm an eyewitness. I'm a living epistle of what happens when the system comes for you. And I think some people relate to that, again, at a very, very base and visceral level. Having said that, if you were to ask me the word that I would use to describe most of what I'm hearing, and I talked to a variety of people literally this week. I was talking to Byron Donalds on a bus in Pennsylvania campaigning for Donald Trump. And on the other hand, talking to Jamie Harrison and other folk, the Secretary of Education, other folk in the Biden administration. So I'm talking to a little bit of everybody in the course of a 3-hour show again every day. And the one word, Breonna Joy Gray, that I would use to describe the mood, I want to go back to that word you used, the mood. In one word, fear. Everybody is afraid of something. And I don't know that in my lifetime I've ever seen an election that has been driven more by fear. The question for me, philosophically, is how great a motivator is fear? We had a deep dialogue on my show earlier this week with one of our guests about whether Black people in particular, historically, have been motivated more by pride than by fear. We came out with pride to vote for Barack Obama. Can we do that again for Kamala? My sense is Sade once saying, never as good as the first time. I don't know that Kamala can hit the same Black numbers that Obama hit because it's not the first time, even though it would be historic in many respects. So this question of whether Black folk are motivated by pride or fear, I just don't know a lot of Black people who do things because they're afraid. The most recent example that I can give you would be the pandemic. A lot of us, and again, not all of us, but a lot of Black folk got that shot, even though they didn't want to, because Black folk don't trust the system, much less the medical profession, Tuskegee, et cetera, et cetera. But many of us got that shot because of why? We were afraid to die. And so we got the shot. But by and large, because Black folk have survived everything from the Middle Passage on, I don't know that we're motivated by fear. And so this notion that the Harris campaign is using to try to scare people, I just don't know that scare tactics are the way into Black people. Let me pause and I'll shut up for a second here. Yeah.
No, I think that's such a good point. It's fascinating. Sometimes when I articulate my politics, explain why it is that I won't be voting for Kamala Harris, people will say to me, well, tell that to an older Black person, you're privileged, you're in a privileged position. And most certainly I am in a relatively privileged position. But what I also know is that when I'm talking to people, and when I used to have an opportunity to talk to people more regularly, like you do through my call-in show, that it was often people who were more economically precarious, who came from backgrounds where they'd already experienced a great deal, that were willing to take a gamble, willing to take a risk with the opportunity for once being some sort of upside. And oftentimes that does mean Black people. So, it is interesting to be constantly told that it is only the privileged that want to shake up the system when, in my experience, it's actually quite the opposite. I want to come back to something that you just said about Kamala Harris and Barack Obama and voting out of pride and voting out of fear. Do you think there are obstacles to Black voters having pride in Kamala Harris? We heard recently Barack Obama accuse Black men of not coming out for her in higher numbers because of misogyny.
Is that we have not yet seen the same kinds of energy and turnout in all quarters of our neighborhoods and communities as we saw when I was running. Now, I also want to say that that seems to be more pronounced with the brothers.
What did you make of that sort of approach? And do you think there's anything else going on that might make folks a little less proud of Kamala than they were of Barack Obama?
Yeah. So as you well know, and your audience knows, 15 years ago when Obama was president, I caught a lot of hell. As a matter of fact, I was canceled, as it were, 15 years ago for doing my best to hold Barack Obama accountable, not because I hated him, but because I love Black people.
Angry words have erupted between two African-American leaders over whether President Obama needs to do more to help the Black community. It started when PBS commentator Tavis Smiley called out Al Sharpton and other leaders by name on the Tom Joyner Morning Show for their recent rhetoric.
Over the past few weeks, a chorus of Black leaders have started singing a new song. I must have missed that choir rehearsal, Jay, because I don't know the words to this new hymn. The president doesn't need a Black agenda, they sing. He's not the president of Black America. He's the president of all America.
In the discussion that followed, Tavis Smiley went even further in his criticism.
I'm telling you, this is the damnation of Black people. We're going to slip down a slope into hell if we start thinking that we can give any leader a pass on addressing Black issues.
Those comments led Al Sharpton to call into the Joyner radio show to respond.
Call for a showdown you don't want. I think what we really need to discuss is how we deal with our community going forward with a Black president and with a considerable amount of disproportionate problems.
And I know that politicians left to their own devices end up being garden variety politicians and not ever rising to the level of statesmen if somebody doesn't hold them accountable.
With all due respect to our president, Barack Obama, Black folk don't need lectures on Black entertainment television. You go to Black entertainment television, Mr. President, respectfully, to lecture Black folk, and then you're wrong, respectfully, when you tell them that these things take time. Dr. King, who you have a bust of in the Oval Office, wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. Stop telling Black folk they got to wait and that these things take time. We can't wait, number one. Number two, Mr. President, respectfully, when you say we can't compare what's happening now to what happened 50 years ago, tell that to the parents of these kids who are being gunned down in America's streets. It is open season on Black men, and it is in many ways as bad as it was 50 years ago. And finally, here's my point. Why go to BET and give a Black folk a lecture, but go to Stephen Colbert and tell jokes? I don't get that.
I said then, and I maintain now, I said this then about Obama, and the same can be said of Kamala if, in fact, she pulls this off. That great presidents aren't born, Brianna Joy Gray. They are made. They have to be pushed into their greatness if they ever get there. There is no Abraham Lincoln if Frederick Douglass isn't pushing him into his greatness. There is no Franklin Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, if there's no A. Philip Randolph pushing him into his greatness. There is no LBJ if there's no MLK pushing him into his greatness. And so great presidents aren't born, they have to be made. And so somebody has got to hold these persons accountable. Or as I said earlier, they end up just being rank and file, garden variety politicians. And so I fear the same thing could happen to Kamala Harris if we don't move past even the pride part and start to hold these persons accountable if and when they get elected. So when Barack comes along a couple weeks ago now, I guess, and does what he does in Pennsylvania, I did a commentary that's been picked up. You know, it's been seen now, I think, millions of times. It's all over the internet. But I did a commentary about, and I think I titled it, "Why None of Us, 10 reasons why nobody in Black America should be surprised at what Obama said in Pennsylvania." It's the top 10 list. I started with Jesse Jackson. Number 10 was Jesse Jackson warning us about this 15 years ago. Folk forget what Jesse said, not even just forget, they've never known the full context of what Jesse said when he got caught on that hot mic incident when he was talking in a Fox News interview about Obama. We all recall the part where he said, "I want to cut his you-know-what off. I want to cut off his private parts." Nobody recalls, Brianna Joy Gray, what he said in its entirety. What he said before he got to that particular part was, "I'm sick of Barack talking down to Black people." I hate the way he talks down to us. And every time he does it, it makes me want to cut off his you know what.
In this exclusive WGN one-on-one interview, a remorseful Reverend Jesse Jackson tonight apologizing for recent disparaging remarks about Democratic presidential nominee Barack Obama. On Sunday, Jackson had just completed an interview with the Fox News channel and made the following comment, he says, in reaction to a recent Obama speech on the morals and responsibilities of African American men.
We'd never heard the first part. Jesse was trying to tell us 15 years ago he has a penchant, Obama does, too often, for talking down to Black people. And then you start with Jesse, and then I worked all the way up from 10 to 9 to 8 to number 1. And the number one reason why I wasn't surprised is because he's done this repeatedly. And I said sort of humorously, although ain't nothing about this really funny. I know Barack Obama is scratching his head like, what just happened here? I've been talking down to these Negroes for 15 years. I did it at Morehouse. I did it on the South Side of Chicago in a Black church on Father's Day. I did it at the Congressional Black Caucus dinner in a room full of them. I've told them 1,000 times, I ain't the president of Black America. I'm the president of all America. He did that for 15 years. I know he's scratching his head thinking, well, what happened? I've been talking down to y'all. So the point is that we have ways, sadly, in which we are so caught up in these African-American first that we lose sight of what it means to hold them accountable. So I ain't mad at nobody if Kamala is your choice. I'm just saying, don't get so caught up in it that we allow people to make arguments that don't make sense, like the misogynist argument that Barack Obama made, when we all know that Black men tend to vote the same way that Black women vote. So the argument just didn't hold water, quite frankly. But then this continuing demonizing and talking down. And the part that got me was he's in a room of Black men who are volunteering for the Harris campaign.
Good point.
It just wasn't the right audience. You're talking to folk who are doing the right thing. Who are you talking to? And so I digress, but you take my point.
No, you do not digress at all. That's an excellent point. And other people have drawn contrast between the way he's willing to speak to Black voters, in this case, literally Black campaign workers versus people of other demographics. And you could say, okay, well, obviously he's going to have a different tone in group. He can get away with more in group than out group. But there is a consistent kind of disrespect. And people have followed this thread even through kind of comparing what was offered to Black Americans in Kamala Harris's attempt to get more Black men back in the fold with this, agenda for Black America versus the agenda for Latino Americans. And some of the commentary has been, well, what Latinos are being offered is much more substantive, and Black men are being offered cryptocurrency for some reason. Now, I think this is a good place to maybe dovetail into the book a little bit, because the book 20 years ago set out an agenda of sorts. Like, these are the kind of policies that could substantially and materially enrich the fate of Black Americans. What is it looking like to you 20 years later? How much action have we seen on those agenda items? What was the process like of revisiting these subjects 20 years later, especially in the context of a political campaign where we could have the first Black woman president who ostensibly is well positioned to provide?
The irony of this is, when this book initially came out, it was on the eve of Barack Obama making his ascension to the White House historically. And here we are almost 20 years later, and Kamala is attempting to make her move to the White House. So in that regard, these parallels are really interesting. I'm looking down, not to ignore you because I have the book in front of me, and I just wanted to just highlight, to answer your question more directly, 3 or 4 of the 10 covenants. Let me start with this. There are 10 covenants in this book now, as there were 20 years ago. But there's a bonus covenant that we've added to this book, Brianna, because there is a particular issue that was not being felt so acutely 2 decades ago that is now, that we could not ignore writing about in this particular 20th anniversary edition. It is, sadly, the issue of homelessness. 20 years ago, Black people were not, Black men who we were just talking about, 20 years ago were not the face of homelessness. Black people writ large, Black men in particular, are now the face of homelessness in this country. That was not the case 20 years ago. So there's a bonus covenant that we could not ignore in this book, the urgency of now in many respects, about the issue of homelessness and how we've been pulled into that, sucked into that, and now again are the face of that particular issue, sadly, in this country. So that's one issue where we have done worse, not better, over the last 20 years, the issue of being unhoused or being homeless. Just looking at these issues right quick. Covenant number 2 is education. The achievement gap still exists. And we have not been able successfully to narrow that gap in ways I wish we had over the last 20 years. And a brilliant professor at UCLA, Dr. Tyrone Howard, writes about that quite soberingly in Covenant number 2. Covenant number 3, correcting the system of unequal justice. Need I say more? Here we are 20 years later, and we are still disproportionately the victims of police misconduct, police brutality. We see it every day. I ain't got to convince nobody of that. The issue of claiming our democracy, Covenant number 6. Here we are still fighting for meaningful voting rights legislation, civil rights legislation that comes up every few years, having to be renewed. We haven't figured that out as yet. They haven't passed the John Lewis bill. So in some respects, we have not made the progress I hope we'd make 20 years later when it comes to claiming our democracy. One final issue, the issue of Covenant number 9, assuring environmental justice for all. I'm in the midst of, and have been for all this year, a 12-month climate justice campaign that our station is spearheading here in Southern California, in LA, but also as a part of my nationally syndicated show. We've been focusing on this issue all year long: climate justice, climate equity, and climate resilience, trying to push Breonna Joy Gray, this issue, higher up on the American agenda, certainly higher up on the African-American agenda. Why? Glad you asked. Because we are the disproportionate victims of these climate maladies, but we're always left out of this conversation. So literally, as part of this year-long campaign focusing on these issues, I created and moderated a conversation on C-SPAN just a couple months ago. It was the first time ever in the history of C-SPAN that the nation had seen a stage full of nothing but Black people, a whole stage full of 12, 13, 14 Black people for 3 hours talking about the issue of climate justice, climate equity, and climate resilience. We have got to be a part of this conversation, given that we are the victim. So there are some areas on the economy we still lag far behind in every single leading economic indicator category, but we made some strides in that area. But by and large, racism, to my mind, is still the most intractable issue in this country. And Johnny Cochran said it famously years ago, that racism is a part of everything in this country. And sadly, to answer your question about what it felt like writing the book, some areas we've made progress in other ways it was hard to come to terms with what the data was telling me, which I couldn't ignore.
You know, I'm struck by how substantive and therefore refreshing it is to hear you talk about actual policies in a kind of electoral climate where policies seem to be the last thing on anybody's mind. As you mentioned, it's about threats. It's a politics of fear. It's about vote for me or else you won't get the other guy. And your point about accountability is really ringing front of mind for me. This is enabled by a lack of pressure from our political or media class to actually ask for anything more of our Democratic nominee, whether it was Joe Biden or now Kamala Harris. You're someone who has taken a great personal risk and harm that role as a journalist in being and holding a politicians accountable very, very seriously. You alluded to it earlier, but just for the sake of the audience who I think might not actually be familiar with your story, would you mind telling them a little bit about what happened with Barack Obama?
Sure. Well, the short version is that this book, The Covenant, 20 years ago, came out. And everybody in the country was on board with the fact that we needed an agenda. In the introduction to the book, I write about the backstory of how the covenant came to be. Matter of fact, let me just reference that right quick because it'll help me answer your question a little bit better. And let me just read 2 short paragraphs. Can I do that right quick, Brianna?
Of course.
I want to just give your audience the backstory for how the covenant came to be. Many of us forgot about this. We recall Obama becoming president, but we don't recall what happened just before Obama becomes president in 2008. I'm reading now from the introduction. In 2000, a conservative U.S. Supreme Court declared George W. Bush winner over Al Gore in a hotly contested presidential race. In the process, Black voters in Florida were disenfranchised, and Black America writ large was in for a rough ride. In 2001, the unthinkable happened, 9/11. President Bush then got America into a war of revenge, vowing to locate an arsenal of WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. The failed search turned out to be a weapon of mass distraction. In 2004, after advancing a political agenda that was antithetical to the best interests of Black Americans, President Bush was nonetheless reelected. At the next gathering of our annual State of the Black Union, following Bush's second inauguration, we began to lay the groundwork for the Covenant with Black America book, a detailed agenda of African-American concerns to ensure that in the very next presidential election cycle, Black voters would not be taken for granted by Democrats or ignored by Republicans. In 2005, President Bush callously abandoned Black fellow citizens, leaving them to die on rooftops in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Collectively, Black America declared enough is enough, never again. We published the text in 2006, and millions of copies were sold, pushing the book to #1 for many weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm fast forwarding here. By the time then, in 2007, the skinny kid with the funny name showed up on stage. The Covenant had primed the pump and helped to raise the civic IQ of millions of Black voters who were fired up and ready to engage politically in unprecedented ways. And then in 2007, Barack Obama gets elected as the first African-American president of these United States. That's the backstory from 2000 to 2007 that really sets the stage for how Barack Obama taps into all that this covenant had done with millions of copies sold to get folk ready for a real robust race where we would hold folk accountable after what George Bush had done, leaving us to die in New Orleans and all the other things I just laid out. So Obama shows up, the book is out, everybody's ready to hold him accountable. We got our agenda, we're ready to go. And when Obama steps up and people realize after the white folk, Negroes act like we were out front for Obama. We were not. When we got to Iowa, That's Hillary was still leading Barack Obama in Black America 2 or 3 to 1, depending on what poll you look at. She was still crushing him 2 to 3 to 1 in Black America. But when the good white folk in Iowa put Obama at #1 and gave us permission to rethink this Negro, we thought about it a second time. The rest, as they say, is history. But once Obama starts to make his ascension, these same Black folk who had supported this agenda of holding all candidates accountable then told me, Tavis, you might want to sit down and just shut up. Now is not the time for this agenda. I'm like, hold up, wait a minute. We had an agenda here. We had a plan here. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted to abandon this agenda for the sake of electing historically the first African-American president. And so I continued to press raising these issues in all of my platforms. And the more I pressed, the more hate I encountered. And it got to a point where literally people just tried to cancel me all those years ago for doing what all of us said we were going to do, presenting an agenda, walking through these public policy issues, holding these persons accountable. But at that point, nobody wanted to talk about accountability. They wanted to talk only about electability, and accountability was getting in the way of his electability. And so I got crushed in the process. So they tried to crush me, at least in the process. So it was an ugly, frankly, the ugliest, most difficult 8 years of my career. And it got to a point where I used 3 words to describe my point of view since folk couldn't seem to understand it. Respect, protect, correct. Respect, protect, correct. I will always respect the president. Barack Obama is my friend. I will protect him from these white supremacist attacks, which he was subjected to every day. But thirdly, I will correct him when the brother is wrong. Black folk could get down with the respect, they could get down with the protect, but they didn't like the correct, and that's when I ran into trouble.
Well, we're really glad you've been so resilient and that you're still here. Me, especially because you have been one of the most important Black media voices that has been willing and open to more progressive ideas and more progressive candidates and given them a really fair shake. And to that end, you recently sat down with Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein, and there was some controversy around it because you were emailed a list of questions from somebody not directly affiliated with the Democratic Party, but in its orbit that were sort of a hit list of questions for Jill Stein that you believe were sort of intended to undermine her in this interview. Can you tell us what went down?
No, it was a DNC individual. The person worked for the DNC.
I see.
No, just to clarify, no, you're on point. Is what you're alluding to. The person is a DNC official, but they sent the email from a private account.
I see.
The email came from a private account, but they work for the DNC. And not only did they send it from a private account, but they had, I think they probably made a mistake. They probably meant to BCC them as opposed to CCing them. But they sent the email from a private account, but they BC'd a number of people, their colleagues inside the DNC. So all the DNC emails are on the CC line, not the BCC line. So I ended up seeing all the persons inside the company, inside the organization rather, who were copied on this particular email. But in the middle of the night, literally, knowing that I was about to interview Jill Stein later that day, Dr. Stein, they sent me a list of questions that I should ask Dr. Stein. And the first thing about the email that kind of got my attention was that they were sending it to me, obviously, like with all due respect, I don't need help writing my questions. I have a staff of producers, and they will tell you my producers do not write questions for me. My producers provide me the research, but never in my career has any producer on any of my shows on BET, on Tom Joyner, on PBS, on NPR, no producer who has ever worked for me has ever written questions for me. I just don't roll that way. Give me the research. I'll figure out where this conversation needs to go based on the research and my instincts. So they apparently felt I needed some help. The DNC did in asking Jill Stein some questions. So they sent me this email. But the thing that got me was that I'm thinking, didn't y'all just get in trouble for this a few months ago? There were two African-American talk show hosts who ultimately, sadly, were fired for receiving questions from the Democratic Party to ask of then candidate Joe Biden. You recall
I forgot about that.
Remember this?
I remember it now, but I had completely forgotten about this. Wait a minute. Are they just doing this to Black radio hosts?
That's exactly the question that Dr. Jill Stein, in the interview, she turns the tables on me and says, Tavis, before we push forward, can I ask you a couple of questions? I said, sure, Dr. Stein. And this is all over the internet. You can find it yourself.
I just want to know, has anybody tried to control your interview of a presidential candidate or any other candidate before? Is this the first time? Is this routine? Is this like totally exceptional? Is this the DNC just assaulting your right as a journalist for the journalism you want to practice?
You want me to answer that?
Yes.
Yeah, as this is the first time I've ever had anything happen to me like this. I think people know who I am, and I'm an independent thinker. As I mentioned earlier, there were two other African-American journalists earlier this year who were fired for asking Joe Biden. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, is this routine? Do people typically send you questions, party affiliation, send you questions to ask of candidates? I said, not routine for me. Has this ever happened before? She asked me. Never in my 30-plus year career. You are an African-American. Are you not being tongue-in-cheek? Yes, I am. Did this not happen to two other African-Americans? It did. One in Philadelphia, one in Milwaukee. Both were sent questions by the Democratic Party. Both asked those questions as they were written without telling people where the questions came from. And both were summarily fired. Sadly, when the story broke, the two networks that hired them, the two stations, had no choice but to fire them to try to protect and save their own integrity. So they'd gotten in trouble for doing this a couple of times before. So Jill Stein had the presence of mind to ask those questions, and that came out in the conversation. So to your question, are they just doing it to Black folk? I do not know. I don't know who they're sending emails to. What I do know is that the only folk who've gotten hemmed up for doing this or getting caught up in this happen to be African-American. That I do know, which leads me to say the following, that when I got that email in the middle of the night, I kind of glanced at it and went back to sleep for a couple more hours before I got up to get ready to start my day and push toward doing my show. It was abundantly clear to me. This is not my first rodeo, and I am not, first of all, I don't need your help writing questions. But number two, I'm not going to get caught up in asking a bunch of questions. And some of the things on their list were issues I was going to cover anyway. But obviously, common sense tells you if I ask any questions anywhere near what's on this list, and I don't somehow let people know that the DNC tried to send me this list, and that story breaks later on, then my integrity is going to get challenged.
Right.
So I had no choice in the moment talking to Dr. Stein, but to say to her, let me tell you what happened last night. So to protect my own integrity, I told the story, where the questions came from. I literally read the email. I asked the questions that they'd written on the email, and Dr. Jill Stein and I went at it for 30 minutes about that email.
How far up? It seems like you don't want to say exactly who the email was from and who was on the email. Can you give us a sense of sort of how senior either the person who sent the email or the people who are CC'd on it are in the organization? Are these the kind of people we would have heard of before?
I think it's fair to say, and again, I'm not trying to your point, I'm not being flippant here or trying to be obtuse. But again, my interest is not in trying to hurt anyone. It is to say the truth. That these questions came to me, and I wanted Dr. Stein to know that the Democratic Party is so tracking her campaign, and frankly, apparently tracking my show, that they wanted to send me these questions. So it's not about putting anybody out there per se. I will say, and answer your question was, these are the person who sent this to me and the person's copied on the email are seasoned members of the comms team at the DNC. Does that answer your question a little bit better?
I mean, that is helpful. That is helpful. And for people who haven't gotten a chance to listen to your interview with Jill Stein yet, can you give us a sense of the nature of some of the questions that they wanted you to ask?
Yeah. So the funny part about it, and Dr. Stein and I kind of laughed about this. I certainly laughed at it, and she got a chuckle as well. There was really nothing on the list that I wouldn't have asked her anyway, essentially. One of the questions was, about David Duke having endorsed her earlier in that week. What do you say about David Duke endorsing your campaign? Now, the spin they put on the question was obviously a Democratic Party spin. But one question was about David Duke. One question was about the New York Times article that had just run a couple of days prior, where the headline basically says Jill Stein says she won't get out of the race no matter who asks her. And the article goes into her own family, quoting one of her adult sons, who basically said, we asked her not to do this. So I asked her about the New York Times article, which I would have done anyway. It's a front page New York Times story. So that was on their list. So David Duke, the New York Times story. They asked her about being funded by the GOP and using lawyers that work for the GOP to help her get on state ballots and advance her campaign.
Everything that was in the New York Times article, frankly.
Pretty much. So all this stuff. Now, what made the email fascinating, though, it wasn't just the questions. It was a 2 or 3 page email, and they had attached to it all their Oppo research on Dr. Stein. So it wasn't just the questions. It was, here's the Oppo research. Here are the links that you should look at if you need more background, more backstory. So it wasn't just questions. There was Oppo research attached to it as well. So it was just a fascinating sort of experience. And again, I'm like Mary J and Jay-Z. I ain't knocking no hustle. I understand they're trying to win and everybody's pushing out their agenda as best they can. I just wanted to be, again, it wasn't about so much outing the DNC. As for me, as much as it was being a truth teller and not getting caught up in the box they were trying to put me in, that I didn't appreciate.
Tavis, Smiley, has this ever happened or anything like this ever happened to you before in all your years of journalism?
Never, ever, never.
Because I saw some people online arguing this is just what campaigns do. You're deeply naive if you think that this isn't a regular occurrence. But you've never experienced a sort of a list like this, a politically charged list from an opponent of someone you were sitting down to interview in advance of the interview?
Let me just say this. I have not seen those kinds of, I haven't had a chance really to look at all the comments about this. Obviously, it's been out there for a few days now, so there are tons of people talking about this, and I understand that. But I would only say to those persons who have commented or opined that I'm naive if I don't understand this is just politics. Hold up. If that's the way you feel, then please share with me what you posted when these African-American hosts got fired from their jobs for doing what you want to now frame as routine. If it's that routine, number one, then why wasn't there some massive response, some protest response to why these 2 Negroes lost their jobs for doing what is routine? Because sending reporters questions ain't routine. If it were routine, the sister in Philadelphia would still have her job. If it were routine, the brother in Milwaukee would still have his job. So one, stop the nonsense. It's not routine in that regard, number one. And the second question I just asked somebody the other day was, if you think it's that routine, do you really think that the Democratic Party or the White House comms team sends questions to NBC, ABC, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post when they're about to interview the president? Do you think they do it to the good white folk in mainstream media? If you think that, put down the crack pipe.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think I saw Roland Martin online making the argument that this is routine. And I asked for your opposition to send information over when your opponent is being interviewed. And so I responded to him, okay, can you tell us what the Trump campaign sent you when you sat down with Kamala Harris? Because that's the sort of dynamic that he's, putting out there as relatively common.
But more to the point, I didn't know you were referencing Roland Martin. And I ain't trying to bash Roland. Roland's doing his thing. I ain't knocking the hustle, as I said earlier. But Roland, in part, lost his job at CNN for getting caught up in the same thing.
Really?
Yes. Google why Roland Martin lost his job at CNN. And Roland Martin and my friend Donna Brazile was at the time sort of running the DNC. And there was a huge controversy about sending Roland Martin questions. That's what happened. So I'm a bit surprised to hear that he said that, because he got caught up in this mess when he was at CNN.
That's fascinating. And the pattern then of it being Black journalists being used as sort of patsies and vessels for the Democratic Party really does speak to this disrespect, frankly, that is very much in line with Obama's tone, and also a failure of any other of the Black voices in media and others in the media space to hold any of the people who are doing this accountable. I'm so appreciative of you joining us here today. I know that you have a heart out because you have to get to your own show. Before you leave, do you want to tell the audience where they can listen to you on air and also where they can find your book?
Sure. The book is called The Covenant with Black America 20 Years Later, available, as they say, wherever fine books are sold. So the book is available pretty much everywhere. You get books. Again, it's called The Covenant with Black America 20 Years Later. All of my socials can be found at Tavis Smiley or at The Real Tavis Smiley. Our station in LA, which I'm sitting in my studio right now, KBLA Talk 1580. All of our socials for the station in LA, heard across the country, is KBLA 1580. All of our socials, KBLA 1580. And that's how you find me. Thank you for the opportunity to actually share that. And let me just close by saying that I want to say two things about you right quick, if I can, on a note of personal privilege, if I might. The first is I have great respect for you, for your courage, for your conviction, for your commitment, for your character, as you've already addressed in this conversation and know rather well. I know something of what it means to be an independent thinker, to be an independent voice, and the price that one pays for going his or her own way. And so I celebrate you for just having the courage of your own convictions to say what it is that you see, and to seek the truth and to speak the truth and to stand on the truth. It means a great deal, Brown Joy Gray. And if I never tell you this ever again publicly, I want to say it now while I'm here, because I so admire you, respect you for doing that, number one. Number two, I appreciate your offering us a different prism, a different way to see not just this moment, but to see our future. Our democracy right now, and I call it an experiment in democracy. I don't really call it democracy. I could argue, if we had the time, that it is really an oligarchy with elections. It's a plutocracy. But we are at best an experiment in democracy. While we have a Madisonian framework for democracy, we have not as yet achieved that, I don't think. And so it takes people, you and Amy Goodman, I can run the list of others who have a more progressive point of view, who are imagining a different kind of democracy, a different kind of republic, a different kind of world that we inhabit, and are pressing to raise these issues to get us to see how fragile this democracy is, how close to the precipice we are. And that's the only way I think we're going to save this democracy, frankly, from itself, or as Dr. King might say, to redeem the soul of America. So there are not a whole lot of folk out there like you. And so I celebrate that, and I'm always honored to be in conversation with you. We're always grateful when you come on our show. And thank you once again for the opportunity to be featured today on the Bad Faith podcast. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm so humbled by that. I feel the same way about you, and even more so because you get to access spaces and audiences that I think it is especially important to access, that are more mainstream, that are more diverse, that are more Black in particular. And you're doing the Lord's work, really and truly. And I'm so grateful for you. So thank you right back at you. And I really am humbled that you spent the time with us today and for your very, very kind words. Please do take care.
Same to you. Thank you.
All right. And thanks to all of you for listening to Bad Faith Podcast. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.